Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and finally the long-awaited part 2 of my Elekit TU-8200R review. I apologise that it's taken so long for me to get this part 2 out, but as you'll see in a moment when we get into the content, there was a huge amount for me to cover, particularly with the tube rolling, to understand the capabilities of this amp once I'd done all the modifications. So in this review, just to give you an idea of what to expect, I'm going to cover off what those modifications were, whether I think they're worth it, how much they cost, how hard they are to do. I'm going to talk about tube rolling in the 8200R and what you can expect from different tubes in the input and in the output stages. I'm going to discuss the general sound quality of the 8200R after the modifications that I put in place. And finally, I'm going to compare the 8200R to the Bottlehead Mainline and the Auris Audio Euterpe from a pure sound quality point of view. So there's lots to cover, and I thank you for your patience letting me pull all this together for you. I should mention, if you haven't seen part 1, you really do need to watch part 1 first, even if you just skip to the bits that are relevant in terms of getting to know the amplifier itself, but I do think it's worth watching before you try and understand this one. I will provide a recap in just a second of what you need to know at an absolute base level, but I think part 1 is really worthwhile understanding. Two other things I'd like to cover off quickly is first of all some thanks going out to retailers that made this possible. The most important thanks of course being to Tube Sound Audio, who were able to arrange this kit at a reduced price to make this review possible. So thank you so much to Tube Sound Audio. This has been an amazing journey and an amazing project that I think is going to be very interesting to those of you that are into tube amps and DIY kits alike. While I'm talking about Tube Sound Audio, Stephen from Tube Sound did let me know that I mentioned in video 1 that he has an amp camp set up where people can go to his location, stay for a couple of days and build the kit with the support of someone, in this case Stephen, who understands what they're doing. That's a great service for people that are new to building DIY kits but want to have a go for themselves. But unfortunately in this world of COVID and lockdowns, it's not always possible. So the good news is that Stephen is now running virtual amp camps. I don't know all the details and the ins and outs, but I'll put a link down below where you can click through to Tube Sound Audio and check out the virtual amp camp options. I think it's a great service and a wonderful way to get into DIY kit building. Just to be clear, there's no kickbacks or affiliates or anything there. I just think it's a wonderful service and I'm very grateful to Stephen for making this review series possible. The other thanks I'd like to put out there are to the Valve store for helping me purchase some of the valves or the tubes at a cheaper price because I knew I needed to buy a whole bunch to roll through a lot of different options. Also to Indie Hi-Fi for loaning me the Sophia electric tubes, which I'll talk about soon. To the members of the Bottlehead forum for helping me talk through some of the modifications I'm going to describe in this video. Even though I wasn't working on one of their products, they were very helpful in talking through the general technicalities of the designs I was thinking of adding. And finally, I want to thank SpeakerBug for free shipping on the output capacitors that I've also included here as an upgrade that I'll talk about soon. So lots of different people have come together to help make this review possible, and I want to thank them wholeheartedly. One final piece I want to mention is that I am very close to announcing the winner of the Galaxy Buds Live. I did mention that I was going to start a giveaway with the Elekit 8200R Part 2 review here, but I'm going to hold that off just for one more video until I can close out the Galaxy Buds Live giveaway. I'll be announcing that on the community page first and also in my next video after this one. So with all of that out of the way, and I thank you for your patience, let's now do a recap of what the 8200R is here. This is a kit tube amp that is a speaker amp first and a headphone amp second. It retails for $895 US, or at least it did when I first put my notes together. And that equates to about 1,500 Australian dollars as a kit. It comes with everything you need, including some stock tubes, so you can build it, have it up and running to drive your passive speakers and or your headphones. Sadly, in stock form, with only this headphone output here, so ignoring the one over here for a moment, in its stock form, the output for the headphones has a crazy output impedance. and it makes the 8200R a pretty mediocre headphone amplifier. It's not bad, but it's just not special and definitely not worth the price if you're looking at it for headphones only. If you're looking at it for speakers, that's a totally different story, and I can't cover that because I don't use it with passive speakers. So basically where we left it after part 1 was I had an amplifier that with a little bit of tweaking I'd managed to organise a lower output impedance box connection that I'll talk about in this video from the back of the speaker taps, and that was letting me know that this amplifier had potential, but it needed a bit of work to really bring it to life. Because a lot of what I'm going to talk about in this video is going to be mods that I've made in the actual circuits of the 8200R, I'm not going to have a lot of B-roll so much as photos to demonstrate or illustrate what I'm talking about. So it won't be my most high production video ever, but hopefully you'll get a clear picture of what I'm talking about each step of the way. And so with that in mind, let's start talking about the modifications that I've made to bring the 8200R to where it is today. And of course, I should talk about the most obvious thing, which is it has had a paint job. The 8200R arrives all silver. It's now in this white and sort of bluey indigo finish here. I haven't yet put the decals back on, so there should be some silver stickers. I haven't put those on yet because I'm still in two minds as to whether or not I need to repaint the blue section of the chassis. Unfortunately, the expansion contraction combined with the positioning of the tube sockets where it comes out of the chassis hole means a little bit of paint has flaked off. It's pretty much invisible when tubes are installed, but I'm in two minds as to whether or not I should redo it. That means you're not going to get to see an exact version of the finished product because it is missing the silver decals, but I think it's come up really nicely. And it's pure coincidence that it happens to match beautifully with the Sophia electric tubes. I haven't yet decided if I'm going to keep the Sophia electrics. I would have to pay for them if I do, and as you'll hear later, that's a big expense and one that I'm still not 100% sure whether I want to make for this amp. But we'll get to that soon. In terms of the modifications I've made to get us here, other than the paint job, I've installed the Lundahl output transformers, which are an upgrade output transformer. I've added some high quality Jansen output caps. I've swapped a couple of other capacitors in there that are related to the power management of the tubes. I changed the power caps, which was a bad move, and I'll talk about that. And I've also added this extra output socket here on the front, and that has some circuitry on the inside to help reduce the output volume, but at the same time not increase output impedance too high. So to put all this in perspective, the end result of this kit you're looking at here, with all of the expenses included, would be roughly $1,400 US. That makes it just shy of 2,000 Australian dollars, meaning that it is a very expensive amplifier at this point. I'm going to put it up next to the Bottlehead Mainline later, which is a little bit over $1,000 US to give you a sense of just where they sit in terms of sound quality. But in terms of feature sets, they are very different. The Mainline is a pure headphone amp that doesn't have the power output of the 8200R here. So they are very different in terms of their features and functions, but in terms of sound quality, I think they're worth comparing, and we will get to that soon. But let's start with probably the biggest and most important upgrade that I made to the 8200R, other than the paint job, and that is the output transformers. The Lundahl output transformers cost about $500 US. It's going to vary depending on where you're buying them from, but about $500 US, and it's a very easy installation. It's also, in my opinion, probably the biggest upgrade you can make to improve the sound of the 8200R. For those of you not familiar with output transformers, this is the part that sits between the tubes, the output tubes, and your headphones. What it's doing is taking care of managing the power delivery and the impedance fluctuations when connecting up to a variable load like a speaker or a headphone. And therefore it's directly in the signal path and has a huge influence on the final sound that you hear through your speakers or your headphones. Now I'm going to talk about it purely from a headphone listening point of view, so I can't comment on its influence on speakers, but with the headphones combined with my low output impedance headphone socket here, it makes a big difference. With the new output transformers installed, the sound from the 8200R becomes immediately more transparent and more detailed. Everything about it just gets improved. It's kind of like going from having average vision that's not too bad but not perfect to then putting on a set of glasses that brings your vision into absolute pristine quality. So it's a really significant upgrade. As for the installation itself, it's very simple. You receive the transformers, you receive the harnesses, and a circuit board that marries the two up. You wire the wiring harness onto the circuit, you then put the circuit onto the output transformer, you screw it in, and you plug it in, and that's it. obviously after removing the original transformers if you had them in there. So you don't have to dismantle the entire amplifier to do this job, and it's a very basic quick soldering task. To put it further into perspective as to what the sound changes were for the output transformers, they removed any final sense of thickness or warmth or richness that the current transformers, the original transformers, were providing, and therefore made everything, as I've already said, more transparent and more detailed. But in the process to show you just how much change there was, it's made me go back and reevaluate all of the tubes I'd listened to before. Some of the tubes that I previously liked, I now don't like so much because I can now hear more of them, or because the weight that was being given by the output transformers has been taken away, and therefore I'm left hearing the truth of the tube and maybe don't like it as much as I did before when it was clouded by the original output transformer. So I can't stress enough, this is a big and significant change to the sound, and I think it's the most significant change you can make in the easiest possible way. It's much more impactful than capacitor rolling, resistor changes. The only other thing that maybe comes close if you're focused on headphones, and in fact maybe is more important if you're focused on headphones, is what I'll talk about with my headphone socket here. But otherwise, the output transformer is absolutely, in my opinion, worth the $500 upgrade. So other than the output transformers, I've also made changes internally to some of the capacitors. Some of these changes were good, some of them not so good. Let's start with the not so good one. I had a bit of a play and thought maybe changing the Panasonic capacitors in the power supply area might improve things if I used an audio grade capacitor. The problem is that power supply capacitors need to have low ESR, which is low effective serial resistance. That means that they're not providing any resistance within the circuit and essentially are just going to flow that power through as it's needed. The audio grade caps don't have ESR figures quoted, so it was a bit of an experiment on my part. When I first hooked it up after making the changes, I did think maybe things had sounded better, but after further listening I realised that it just sucked all of the body and weight out of the music. It made everything sound interesting and unique, but it was definitely not preferable from an overall sonic perspective. So my advice to you if you're making modifications to this is that if you are going to play with those little tiny low ESR capacitors, make sure you're sticking to low ESR capacitors in their place. And honestly, I don't think there's a lot of benefit in changing them anyway. So it's not something I'd recommend you do, but if you do, make sure you stick to low ESR. With that whoopsie out of the way, let's now talk about some capacitor upgrades that I think might have made subtle but positive improvements. Now, normally when making modifications to circuits like this, it's beneficial and recommended to do one modification at a time. That allows you to first of all hear what's different after you've made the changes, but also troubleshoot issues more easily. In my case, I broke that rule because there were only so many times I wanted to open, tinker, and reassemble the 8200R. And so I did all of my capacitor rolling in one go. What that means is I replaced a couple of the caps that are off to the sides of the circuit in the power management sector for the tubes. So these are different to those low ESR caps I'm talking about. And then the other capacitors I played with were the output capacitors that are directly within the signal path. What I found in doing that modification was a slight improvement in transparency, resolution and detail, but it's not a huge change. I'd also put most of that change down to the output capacitors more so than those ancillary capacitors I mentioned. It is worth noting that none of these capacitors fit particularly well in the stock setup. So I had to do some creative insulation and bending of the capacitor leads to fit them all in, but the end result is a safe and snug fit in the chassis. What it means though is that by the time you spend $60 to $70 and fiddle around bending and insulating the capacitor leads, it may not be worth the hassle. I think for me, if I had my time again, I probably wouldn't bother with that so much, but I would definitely put in the output transformers. So at this point, if I didn't have this socket on the front, what I would have had is a fantastic sounding speaker amp with incredible transparency, incredible detail, lots of speed and snap in the transients, but one that still sounded pretty mediocre through the headphone socket. And that's because of the resistor network that's used to produce the power coming through the headphone socket. But at the same time, adding a huge output impedance that just kills the ability of the 8200R to work with anything below about 300 ohms. And ideally, you really want to be even higher still. My solution to that is probably the most complex of this whole setup, but it's also the most impactful if you're looking at this as a headphone amp. What's going on inside here, and I'll show you in some pictures. They're not going to be pretty, but they're there. What's going on inside here is I've installed a Switchcraft inline style chassis mount socket. What I mean by inline is it's kind of a barrel style socket rather than a short stubby socket that I wouldn't have been able to fit because there's a capacitor right next to where that has to go in. So I had to find a very specific connector that would allow me to have this long barrel take the connections I needed to make further back in the chassis. From there though, I also had to find a way to add the resistor network required to bleed off some of the power without increasing the output impedance. Otherwise, we're right back to where we are on the stock output. So after much playing around, what I ended up doing was using a set of high quality Mundorf resistors and installing them in an L-pad setup. Now, if you're not familiar with L-pads, they're pretty simple in concept. What you're going to do is run a higher impedance resistor in the actual signal path, and then you're going to bridge a parallel resistor off that path that is of a much lower value and take that to ground. So what that's going to do is bleed off some of the power, but at the same time not present a high output impedance to your headphones. In my case, what I landed on was a 22 ohm inline resistor and a 1 ohm resistor bleeding off to ground. That's resulted, I can't remember the calculations now, but it's resulted in a 20 something odd decibel drop in output volume, and it's just right to give me usable volume with most headphones in and around sort of the 9 to 12 o'clock range. One of the challenges with this sort of a setup is you're looking to balance the inline resistor, keeping it low enough that you're not pushing your output impedance too high, while at the same time making sure you're creating enough usable volume. A couple of things to point out if you're thinking about doing this mod for yourself is that you could do it in an external box like the pictures I'm going to show you here, or you could build into the chassis like I have. The chassis solution is obviously more permanent, but I do think it looks pretty good. It's not too far out of the keeping with the rest of the design look, but it does mean as well that it's not going to mute your speaker outputs. So this is very much something you should do only if you're comfortable having a headphone only amplifier, or having some way of switching off your speakers when you're not wanting them. You could of course take the inline style box and plug that into the sockets on the back when you're using it, and then plug your speakers back in when you're not using it, but that to me feels like a hassle. So this to me is a mod where if you're looking at this as a headphone amplifier, it's worth doing that. If you're really looking at it as a multi-purpose amplifier, it's probably not going to be such a great idea. And in that scenario, what I'd say is you need to prioritize what this amp is to you. If it's a speaker amp predominantly, with occasional headphone use where you don't mind a slightly altered frequency response, then I would just stick with the stock setup. If it's predominantly going to be a headphone amp, then you've really got some thinking to do. It might not be an ideal combo amp if you are looking to run speakers, so do think about that carefully. So after all this tweaking and playing, as I said, we're probably looking at about a $1,400 amplifier here, not including the time of course. There's been hours and hours and hours poured into this, but in my opinion, it's resulted in an excellent sounding amp. And so with that in mind, I think what I might do now is talk about the sound quality first and put tube rolling at the end of this video so you can go there and look at that if you're interested, but that you don't have to watch through it if you just want to know how this sounds. That therefore comes with a caveat that everything I'm about to talk about with the sound quality is going to be somewhat dependent on tubes. My setup for all of my sound quality testing was using a pair of Philips NOS Jan 5814 tubes as the input, and using the Mullard EL34 brand new production, relatively affordable output tubes in the output sockets. I put the Sophia Electrics back in here because I think they look cool, but realistically, all of my testing I deliberately kept with very affordable tubes. In the tube rolling section, I'll talk about some new production input tubes, so if you don't want to go hunting for NOS options, you don't have to. That said, these Philips tubes are not expensive. I think I picked them up for about $30 Australian a pair, so the total tube setup that I've used for my sound quality testing, with the Mullards that aren't installed and the Philips that are, that total setup is probably around about $60 to $70 Australian. And it's a decent upgrade from the stock JJ tubes, but at the same time, it's not a huge problem if you just want to use the JJs. What I'm about to describe is still going to be mostly true, with a few variations that I'll cover off in the tube rolling section. And what I heard as I listened to my fully modified 8200R with the low output impedance socket here, and mostly using the Focal Euterpeas, was a headphone amp that is wonderfully detailed and transparent. It's got fantastic extension in the treble, but it is still fairly smooth in the treble thanks to the tube characteristics. It's not heavily rolled off or anything like that, but it's not overly bitey in the treble, and that to me is a positive of this amplifier. There's no lack of detail, there's no lack of clarity, but it also doesn't get nasty. One area that the 8200R is a bit weak though, and this is common to most tube amps, is that it struggles with bass extension. The quality and quantity of bass, once it gets above whatever the frequency of roll-off tends to be, that's really good. But it doesn't quite extend as low as I'd like it to. Now, when I tried to do some frequency sweep measurements to see if it showed signs of roll-off, I wasn't actually getting any sign of it. So I think it's rather in the complexity of the music that the roll-off occurs, rather than in a frequency sweep where it's one tone at a time. I'd estimate though that the roll-off's probably happening somewhere around about the 80 to 100 Hz mark as it starts to just taper off a little bit. It's not drastic or huge, it's probably dropping a couple of dB. But it is enough that you notice it when you switch between a solid state amp, which isn't going to have that problem, or another excellent tube amp, which I'll get to soon. The good news is that bass extension issue is probably the only problem I can find with the sound of the 8200R. Everything else is great. The tonality is really neutral and natural. It's got a little bit of richness because it is a tube amp, but again, that's going to vary from one tube to the next. The great thing is that everything sounds just right all the way through the frequency range, regardless of which tubes you're using. The tubes bring their own character to each sound, but never does it throw anything completely off the mark of what it should sound like in a natural and realistic playback. All of the transients, so things like drum hits and cymbals and stuff like that, all of those, the snap of the different sounds at the beginning and the leading edge of the notes, all of those are delivered really crisply and really cleanly. As I said before, the amp never gets harsh, but the good news is it doesn't soften or blunt anything. It's still got energy and rhythm and drive to it, which is fantastic. As you'd expect from a good tube amp, soundstage is fantastic both in terms of space, overall the size of it, also the separation and space between individual sounds is great, and the focusing of the image is excellent as well. That is an area where the tubes can have a significant impact in terms of the tightness of the focus and also the overall sense of size and depth of the soundstage. But all in all, almost every tube I listened to was good. I'll cover off soon a couple that might surprise you where I didn't think it was so good, but most of them are really strong. All in all though, to wrap up the sound of the 8200R in a single statement, I'd describe it as wonderfully transparent and clear and resolving as a tube amp. And I put the as a tube amp on the end there because it does have a little bit of tube character, meaning that the mids have got that little bit of magic to them, but it's in no way ever a thick, rich, sludgy amp. This is an amp that is similar to solid state in its sound, but with that dash of tube magic. And of course you can amp that up or amp it down depending on the tubes that you use. Something that I didn't cover off in part 1 because it really relates to sound quality, so I'm covering it now, is that the 8200R also has the ability to work in multiple modes. The 8200R can work as an ultralinear amplifier, as a pentode style amplifier, or as a triode style amplifier, and it all comes down to how it's driving the tubes. It's designed specifically as an ultralinear amplifier, but it does allow you, as I said, to try the other modes. So of course I did. What I found that was in triode mode, as you'd expect if you've had any experience with single-ended triode amps, it had this extra richness and kind of character to the mid-range that's really, really enjoyable. But it does come at the cost, I believe, of a little bit of resolution and detail compared to ultralinear mode. What makes these comparisons a bit difficult, of course, is that to make these changes, you have to access the circuit boards. And that means either testing it while the circuitry is exposed, which is not advisable from safety reasons, or you have to make the changes, put it all back together, switch it on, let it warm up, have a listen, switch it off, let it cool down. You get where I'm going here, taking a long time between each of the changes. And so as I switched between these, I am basing a lot of this on auditory memory, but I'm comfortable that the differences were significant enough that what I'm sharing with you is accurate. What's hard for me to say is exactly how big the difference was. So I'm comfortable that ultralinear is a little bit more transparent and clear and detailed than triode mode. but I'm not exactly clear on how much. Likewise, triode mode definitely brings a bit of richness and character to the mids, but I can't really describe how much. Moving over to pentode mode, which extracts a bit more power output from the amp should you need it for your speakers. Pentode mode provided a really punchy and articulate sound, but to my ears it was just a bit too forward and a bit too forceful. I liked the balance of the ultralinear mode, and it makes sense because that's what this amplifier was designed to do. It's great that you can try pentode and triode modes, but my preference would be to leave it always in ultralinear mode because I think you're getting the best of both worlds. You're getting that slightly relaxed sound from tubes compared to the punchiness and forwardness of the pentode mode, but you're also getting the clarity and transparency in ultralinear mode that you lose a little bit in the triode setup. So having covered off all my general sound impressions of the 8200R, let me give you a specific track example to talk through what I heard, and then I want to talk about the amplifiers that I've compared it to. The track that I used for these comparisons was The Crack Up by the Black Sorrows. There's lots going on in this track, lots of different textures and sounds, multiple vocalists. There's a lot of busyness in the track, and what the 8200R did beautifully was separate all of those. I was able to hear every single instrument perfectly in a nice big soundstage, but still with lots of texture and detail, so things were not overly clinical or sterile, but at the same time beautifully separated. As I've already alluded to, the thing that does hold the 8200R back once again strikes here, and that is that the bass drum that drives this track along is missing just a little bit of presence from the 8200R. It doesn't quite have the authority that I know it's meant to have because I know this track really well. That said, if I didn't know the track well or I wasn't comparing it to anything else, it sounds fantastic. The sense of space and clarity of where each instrument and vocalist is placed while still maintaining perfect cohesion makes the 8200R an incredibly nice listen through a set of headphones. And I'll talk soon about some specific headphones that I've tried it with to let you know how it matches up. Before we do though, let's talk about comparisons. The most obvious comparison for me the whole time has been my Bottlehead Mainline. I love my Mainline. It's an amp I built years and years and years ago, and it continues to hold its place in my collection because nothing yet has bested it. The 8200R should in theory have been an amp to do that. It's more expensive, it's more powerful, it's got more versatility of tubes for me to find a set that takes it even further than the Mainline, which is basically limited to the tubes it comes with because there's not a lot of different variants of those tubes. And yet what I found was that putting the two side by side, it's very hard to say which is better or worse. The Mainline doesn't produce quite the soundstage that the 8200R is capable of. But on the flip side, it's got the presence that I'm missing from the 8200R coming from the bass, but it carries all the way through the mids. What that means is that the sound has a more natural and realistic overall tonality to it. Not that the 8200 is bad, but when you put the two side by side, you kind of go, oh, that's what the vocals should sound like. The 8200R has pulled just a little bit of meat off the bones that I think is meant to be there. Having said that, I think they both sit, if you're talking about a continuum, they both sit within a range that I would call very close to natural and neutral. In other words, neither is the 8200 too thin or the Mainline too thick. They're both excellent, but the Mainline for me just wins out for the sense of drive and presence that it commands because of the better bass extension. I still don't know what voodoo Dan and the team at Bottlehead pulled off to get the Mainline to perform the way it did, but it's really the thing that sets it apart from any other tube amp I've tried. The 8200R is absolutely stellar, but if you put the two side by side for price, I'd still choose the Mainline. It's cheaper and it performs as well as, and in some ways better than the 8200R. The trade-off in soundstage is not really a big deal for me because they're both excellent in their own ways. Of course, if you're looking at this, thinking about both amps for yourself, do keep in mind the Mainline is nowhere near as powerful and it can't drive speakers at all. So do factor that in, but if you're looking for just a headphone amp for normal headphones, not something like a Susvara that I'll talk about soon, then the Mainline is a great choice. If you want versatility, you want more power, the 8200R is absolutely great. Speaking of the driving capabilities of the Mainline and the 8200R, while I was doing this comparison, I thought it was a good chance to cycle through some different headphones and see which ones work better with each of the amplifiers. Again, I was using the Mullard EL34s on the 8200R with the Philips NOS Jan 5814s. And what I found was that with one exception, any of these headphones would work great on either. And I've deliberately stuck to high-end quality headphones here because I think if you're spending this sort of money on amps, you're most likely going to be driving top-end headphones with it. That's not to say you can't use cheaper headphones. I regularly do use cheaper headphones with these, but I wanted to share the maximum performance level type qualities of each of these amps with the various headphones I'm talking about. The first headphone I've already mentioned was the Focal Euterpe. It pairs beautifully with both of these amplifiers, but personally I'd probably lean ever so slightly towards the Mainline with the Euterpe. The Euterpe benefits from that extra little bit of weight that the Mainline has, and it does bring the music more to life with a headphone that's not particularly strong in the bass to start with. Moving on to the Meza Imperians, both headphone amps sound great with the Imperians. It comes down to a question of which one do you like the character of more. In the Mainline, things become a bit more focused and a bit tighter in the imaging, whereas on the 8200R you get a wonderful sense of space and separation of sounds that's equally as enjoyable but different. Moving over to the very differently tuned Beyerdynamic T5 third generation, and all of a sudden that's where the 8200R for me takes a slight edge on the Mainline. Because the T5 is quite a rich, warm sounding headphone to start with, the slightly lighter weight of the 8200R is beneficial and preferable when balanced with the T5's warmth. So as you can see, both of these headphone amps work wonderfully with most headphones, but my leaning would be if you've got a warmer type headphone, go to the 8200R. If you've got a leaner type headphone, go to the Mainline. Anything that kind of runs down the middle can go in either direction. Finally, earlier I mentioned the Susvara, and I mentioned the fact that the Mainline can't even drive it, because the Susvara requires gobs and gobs of power. The good news is the 8200R can drive the Susvaras beautifully and does so beautifully. You do need to run it direct off the speaker taps, so none of these resistor network setups that we've got going on here, just straight from the output taps for the speakers. It doesn't give you a huge amount of volume range, so by about 9 o'clock I was hitting the levels that I was comfortable with. But the sound quality was great. I've actually got a custom cable on the way so that I can do my Susvara testing with the 8200R as one of the amps, so I'll talk a little bit more about it in my review of the Susvara coming soon. At this point though, what I've hopefully demonstrated is that the 8200R and the Mainline are both top shelf headphone amplifiers. You can't go wrong with either of them, they've just got slightly different characters. And so I put the 8200R up against one other amp, and that was the Aurus Audio Euterpe while I had it here. The Euterpe, in case you haven't seen the review, is a beautifully made headphone amp. It's got a wonderful clean and extended sound, but also with a touch of tube magic. And without going into too much detail, what I would say is that depending on the tubes that you put into the 8200R, I think the two amps can be very similar. Of course, with the Euterpe, you can buy it without having to assemble it, and it's a very unique and striking design. With the 8200R, you either have to buy it pre-built, which is going to increase the cost, or you have to build it yourself. So do factor that into your considerations. The 8200R has more tube rolling options, the Euterpe is more limited. What's common about both is they both have the slight lack of bass extension that I've already talked about at length. Both have the ability to provide really magical, tubey mids, but never getting thick, always remaining transparent and detailed and clear. So whilst the Mainline sits apart as a bit unique as a tube amp due to its ability to have that weight and presence to the sound, the 8200 and the Euterpe sit in the other camp where they do lack a bit of bass extension but have wonderful clarity and quality to the mid-range. So I'd highly recommend any of these three amps depending on your tastes and your needs. And so having just mentioned that depending on the tubes used in the 8200R, it can kind of match the Euterpe in terms of that magic that it provides, it's probably a nice segue to start talking about tube rolling in the 8200R. And I'm going to start off by saying that if you were to ask me straight out what is the best tube combination for the 8200R, I'd say to you, it's a really complex answer. The reality is that it depends on the headphones you're using, the music you're listening to, which tubes are best in the output socket depends on which tubes are best in the input socket, and vice versa. So there's no simple straight answer. There are still combinations in the tubes that I have here that I haven't yet tested out. And so I'm not going to try and sit here and say this is the optimal combination. What I'm going to tell you is some of the characteristics of some of the tubes that I particularly loved. After that, half of the fun is for you to go out, get the tubes for yourself and give them a try. In terms of input tubes, I tried 4 key input tubes in my journey. Starting of course with the JJs as a baseline, I'm not going to talk a great deal about those, but what I am going to talk about is 2 sets of NOS tubes and 2 sets of new production tubes. I was really keen to focus on testing some new production tubes in the 8200R, because obviously tracking down NOS tubes can get expensive in a hurry, and so everything that you're going to hear me talk about here is designed to be either easy to get and or affordable. The first tube I want to talk about are the Electro-Harmonix gold pins. Looking around a bunch of the forums, I tend to find that the Genelex gold lines get most of the attention in recommendations for new tubes. But I think the Electro-Harmonix golds have a really good place. They're definitely a different sound to the gold lines, they're a thicker, richer sounding tube, and they focus things more in on the center soundstage. That said, they also bring a nice sense of punch and note weight to the overall presentation. And that's where things get a bit tricky, is because if you had a set of output tubes that are a little bit light in weight, then you might actually really like the richness of the Electro-Harmonix gold pins. On the flip side, if you had a richer, warmer output tube, the gold pin Electro-Harmonix wouldn't be a great choice. Moving over to the Genelex gold lines, they're a very different story. They provide a sound that is dry and clean and a lot brighter than the Electro-Harmonix. Not too bright, but in comparison a lot brighter. The bass is still punchy and imaging is clear, but I felt like all the sound was a little bit flat in comparison to the Electro-Harmonix that had a bit more depth to it. I personally am not a huge fan of the Genelex gold lines in the 8200R, and do keep in mind every amplifier is going to be different. So everything I'm sharing with you is only relevant to the circuitry of the 8200R. If you have a different amp, the Genelex gold lines might sound great, but for me, they weren't a particularly good fit with the 8200R. Moving on from the new production options like the Electro-Harmonix and the Genelex, I then started looking for affordable NOS options on eBay. And the first thing I found were the Sylvania Jan 5814A. These are a NOS tube. They're still a 12AU7, as all of the input tubes I'm talking about are, but they have this Jan 5814 specification. The Sylvanias provide a really textured and detailed sound that's probably tonally on par with the Genelex gold lines, but with a much better sense of space and openness and depth in the soundstage. They do remove a little bit of the imaging focus that something like the Electro-Harmonix or the Genelex have, but what you get in return is a really snappy, clean and lively sound with a generally good soundstage size. My only complaint with the Sylvanias was on some tracks, and again depending on the output tubes, they could get just a little bit snappy and harsh on some of the higher frequencies. And that brings me to my final input tube, which is a very similar tube to the Sylvania, and it's the Philips equivalent tube, also Jan 5814A designation, still 12AU7, and also a NOS tube. NOS meaning new old stock. So these were produced many years ago and are still sitting around in boxes somewhere unused. The Philips tubes, which is what I've got installed here, are absolutely my favourite in the 8200R. They provide the perfect balance to me of smoothness but detail and extension in the top end, good soundstage size, good presence and note weight, and an overall positive listening experience. Out of all the tubes I've tried, I definitely think the Philips are my first choice. I've actually bought a second pair of these as a backup. And then I'd probably actually go for the Electro-Harmonix as a specific choice when pairing with different output tubes that might need a different presentation. That said, I want to put a really big emphasis on this next point. It's not worth spending a fortune of time or money on rolling tubes in, I think, any amp, but particularly from what I'm finding in the 8200R. It's not because each tube doesn't sound different, they definitely do. But it's because every tube I've tried, maybe the Genelex being a slight exception, all of them sound fantastic. And the Genelex doesn't sound bad, I just don't like the flatness of sound that it creates. But almost everything else I've tried sounds absolutely fantastic. They're different, but they're all great. And it's one of those things, if you weren't comparing them, you'd probably never think twice and you'd just thoroughly enjoy what you heard. So don't get hung up on tube rolling too much. Do it if it's fun, but don't think you have to do it. You have to chase some pinnacle of sound quality, because there's really no such thing. Every tube has a different characteristic and a different sound that's got pros and cons. And so now let's take a quick look at some of the output tubes that I think are worth discussing. These were much harder to compare because they get very hot during use, and therefore there's a long time delay between switching it off, the tubes cooling down, swapping them over, powering it up, and listening again. So I'm just going to talk about some of the tubes I've used and my general impressions of each. Once again, I tried to favour new production tubes where I could. I've got a couple of NOS options thrown in just for fun, but most of these are new production. And the first are the very affordable Tungsol 6L6GC STR. These provide a sound that's very similar to the stock tubes, but just more open, more resolving sound. They're an excellent budget choice to upgrade the amplifier a little bit without spending too much. They maintain the tonal characteristics straight out of the box, which is a relatively rich and warm mid-range, but still with good detail and good overall presentation of sound. Another option that I picked up on eBay, these are a NOS option I think, but they're very cheap, are the Russian 6Pi3S tubes. These, as I understand it, are an equivalent to a 6L6, but they might have been a military spec or something similar. These are a great example of a tube where I'd probably want the Electro Harmonics input tube that I talked about earlier, because the 6Pi3S is just a bit lean and lacking an overall presence. Their sound is articulate and detailed and clean, but it just lacks a little bit of weight, and it's not a tube I'd go to unless I had an appropriate input tube to balance that off. So let's move on now to a different family of tubes in the EL34 range. Because remember, if you think back to part 1, the benefits of the 8200R, one of the benefits is that it's got an auto biasing circuit. And that means you can use all different sorts of tubes in the 8200R and it's going to adjust itself accordingly. My first EL34 tube experience was with a NOS tube I picked up off eBay. These were moderately expensive, but I think they were probably around $40-50 each maximum. These are a Chinese EL34 tube. Their sound is rich and smooth. They've got a wonderful focus in on the vocals and really draw your attention to the vocals, but not overly thickening it up, just kind of drawing you into the mid-range a bit. They also managed to bring forward the mid-range textures, so as I said, they're not overly thickening things because it's still very textural and detailed, but just with an emphasis into the mids. I also found that the bass got maybe just a little bit fuller and slower, but not necessarily in a bad way. It's all going to depend on the headphones you're listening to it with and what your preferences are. Another EL34 tube I tried was a new production Mallard tube, and I've already referred to these. These are my favourite go-to tube, short of maybe the Sophia Electrics that I'm about to talk about. The Mallard EL34s are just a great choice. They're cheap, they sound great, and they're going to be easy to get because they're new production. The Mallards aren't quite as rich through the mids as the Shugwangs that I just mentioned before, but they've still got that beautiful EL34 tonality. They've got better top-end extension than the Shugwangs, and that does help to open up their sound. Ultimately, to me, the Mallards are a real standout of why new production tubes can be both affordable and great quality. They hit the mark for me on the ideal balance of tonality, tubey magic richness through the mids, but without ever thickening things up and taking away from transparency and resolution and detail. My only complaint about them is I don't think they're the best looking tube, but that's not why I'm buying them. My final EL34 option is what you see installed here now, and these are the Sophia Electric EL34s. They're a new production premium tube, and as I mentioned before, I've got Indie Hi-Fi to thank for lending them to me. Whether I should say thanks or not, I'm not really sure. And the reason is, these are very expensive tubes. You're looking at a few $100 per pair for a set like this. So it's a really big investment, and going into this, I really wanted to not like them because I didn't want to be tempted to spend that sort of money on tubes. The good news / bad news is that they sound amazing. They've got a sound that is rich, effortless, detailed, spacious. They're just perfect. For me personally, the EL34 sound is what I like most in the 8200R, and the Sophia Electrics are just the perfect embodiment of everything that the EL34 can be. In other words, they are an EL34 tube, and they're the best example of an EL34 that I've tried. I know there's a few other expensive premium brand new production brands out there, and I haven't explored those. So I'm not saying these are the best you can get, but they're absolutely the best that I've heard. Now we've got just 3 more tubes to go, and we're sort of going to change families again, but I think they're sort of related, maybe they're cousins, to the KT77. In this case, this is a Genelex Gold Line tube, and the KT77 for me is a very similar sound to the EL34. It's still a very vocal focused, mid-range type focused tube. It's got a really nice kind of mid-bass punch to it if you want a slightly more energetic sound. but it does smooth off the top end just a little bit. The KT-77 is a tube that I haven't yet decided if I'm going to keep or on-sell, because to me it's a unique sound that's very enjoyable, has some great characteristics, but also has not flaws, but it's got some characteristics that I'm not always going to want. That said, of all the Genelex tubes I've tried, it is my favourite. And speaking of the Genelex tubes that I've tried, another tube that I bought thanks to the Valve store was the KT-88 Genelex Gold Line. The Gold Line KT-88 is a very dynamic and forceful sounding tube. It's almost a bit V-shaped as a tube. I'm not suggesting it actually is changing the frequency response that dramatically, but how it sounds is like all the emphasis goes to the bass and the treble, and the mids are maybe a little bit sucked out. I personally don't find the Gold Line KT-88 to be a particularly engaging listen on the 8200R, and so all in all I've been quite disappointed with the Genelex Gold Lines, and that's both good news and bad news. It's a shame because they're a very readily available tube, but it's good because I think you can actually do better by spending less on other new production tubes. Keeping in mind, of course, that everything I'm saying relates to the 8200R only and not other tube amps necessarily. Finally, my very last tube was still a KT-88, but this time it's the Sophia Electric KT-88. So again, a very expensive tube, new production, top of the range quality. And the Sophia Electrics showed me what a KT-88 probably should sound like, but at the same time they showed me that I'm not a fan of the KT-88 sound. The Sophia Electrics are a beautiful tube, but unfortunately the KT-88 characteristics have this same sort of V-shaped emphasis, where everything's about the treble and the bass, and the mids are just not as well defined as I'd like them to be. The sound's not bad by any stretch, but it's just a little bit unnatural to my tastes. Everything's wonderfully separated, there's good space. With the Sophia Electric version, things are much smoother, so there's not quite as much force and kind of in-your-faceness from them as there is from the Gold Lines. But the overall presentation just hasn't got that natural coherency that the KT-77s, EL-34s and the 6L6GCs had. So to sum up my tube rolling experiences with the 8200R, I think in terms of input tubes, anything from the JJ Electric 12AU7s through some of the decent cheap NOS options such as the Philips or the Sylvania 5814s, any of those I think are great choices. I'd personally steer away from the Gold Lines, but I do like the Electro Harmonics. Moving into the output tubes, what I'm hearing is that you can't really go wrong with any of the 6L6 family or any of the EL34 family. KT66s that I haven't tried and KT77s, both of which are kind of more related to the EL34 side of things, those might be just fine. But for me, I'd steer clear of KT88s even though this amp can drive them. It's also worth flagging here that again I'm talking about headphones. If you're driving speakers, the KT88s might be wonderful, particularly if you want something that's bringing a bit more treble and bass and not focusing on the mids if you happen to have a set of MIDI speakers. So I can't speak to the speaker performance of these various tubes, but for headphone amps, that's my impressions. And so after this massive marathon of a part 2, first of all, I want to say thanks for watching if you're still with me. And to wrap things up, I want to say that the journey of the 8200R has been a really fascinating one. It's not the most fun kit to build, but it's very straightforward. The end result without modifications is mediocre as a headphone amp, but great as a speaker amp as I understand it. After some modifications, it becomes an excellent headphone amp if you're willing to trade off either convenience or any use at all of speakers. So it is a bit of a mixed bag. It's one of those amps that I'm probably going to keep in my collection because A, it performs well, and B, I've poured my heart and soul into it. But if I was going to buy a tube kit headphone amp, I still would recommend to everybody out there to buy themselves a Bottlehead Mainline if you're looking at this price point. Again, the Mainline doesn't do speakers, so if speakers are an issue, the 8200R is great. But for pure headphone use, the Mainline still holds the crown for me as the best kit tube headphone amp. For me, the 8200R holds the crown for the most versatile tube kit amp, as long as you're willing to do some tweaks and mods. So I hope you found this review useful. If you have, let me know in the comments down below what you liked most about this review, and if there's any other kit style DIY type amps that you'd like me to see if I can test out. For now though, thanks for watching, I'll leave you to the music, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.